My name is Sean McDonough, and this is Troubleshooting Performance Issues in SharePoint Online Sites. I am an Office Apps and Services MVP. I've been one for roughly the last 4 years. I started working with SharePoint back in 2004. I am a developer at heart, but I'm still doing a lot of active coding, PowerShell scripting, as well as I do IT pro and administrator type work out of necessity. I maintain what I call a home basement data center here, but I also do a lot of SharePoint Online administration. I became an IT pro admin out of necessity. Back in the SharePoint 2007 days, those of you who remember it, the only way to get a working SharePoint environment was to set up a farm of MOS 2007 itself. And the level of knowledge that was required to do that grew dramatically from 2003 to 2007. Personally, I have a specific interest in SharePoint performance optimization and troubleshooting. Hopefully that will come through in this session. I have a specific, or rather I'm into augmented reality and virtual reality. I play a lot of Magic the Gathering, probably far more than I should online. That's my ID, Solus pound 18161 if you want to challenge me sometime. I have tons of other senseless pursuits and interests. Many of them revolve around my family. I have twins, Brendan and Sabrina, who are actually not 12, they're 13 now. So they graduated 7th grade going into 8th grade. And my wife, Tracy, who is the only doctor our family probably will ever see. She is actually a clinical psychologist by training, but she teaches at a local university. And no, I'm not a patient that I'm aware of. And as mentioned, I'm a lover of all things donut. Many of you who are related to Mike Fitzmaurice or share social media connections with me or Fitz might remember this picture. It was courtesy of the Rencore team. They gave him the pretzel. This is the pretzel that got Fitz. Jeff Shuey was kind enough to send me a blow-up donut. And I used that donut to try and reenact this famous scene with Fitz. I think I achieved success, or at least a degree of it, but you can be the final judge. So first, here's what we're going to be talking about in the next 30 minutes or so. I'd like to introduce the companion tool that we fall back to for much of our troubleshooting. I want to share a moment about where we are and acknowledging that. It'll seem painfully obvious, but there are some points that are worth mentioning or mentioning again out of this. Cloud guidance, SharePoint Online guidance for you folks, as well as some things to watch out for when you're building or creating your own SharePoint Online sites and pages. And towards the end, I'll have my contact information. You can always follow up with me to get additional insight on any of these things or for questions you might have. So without further ado, let's first make an important acknowledgement. And I tell people that this tree on the left represents Microsoft or Office 365. And Microsoft refers to the Office 365 service as an evergreen service, meaning they can pretty much change anything anytime and are within their right to do so and do so frequently. This carries some implications, namely that the information I'm going to share with you has a shelf life. Anybody who has been designing training that involves SharePoint Online, writing books, blog posts, things like that, is painfully aware of this shelf life problem. And the reason I raise it is because I hope that in 5 years, some of you, or maybe only one person or two, will find this presentation, pull it up, and you'll discover that some of the information I might be sharing is no longer accurate due to SharePoint Online service change. And you might have a desire to send me hate mail or comment. And I know some of you are laughing, but this has happened on my own personal blog. People find a post I wrote 5 years ago and call attention to the fact that, well, SharePoint Online doesn't work that way. It works this way. Well, yeah, it does now, but it didn't 5 years ago. So if we can agree to this, that you're not going to send me that hate mail, I'll continue. And I'm assuming all of you will accept that because you're going to continue on with this presentation. If you don't, you won't see the rest of it. So let's talk a little bit about the SharePoint Page Diagnostics tool and what it can do for us. The SharePoint Page Diagnostics tool is that one tool I was referencing a little earlier. And it is something you can get for free from the Google Chrome store. So it's technically an extension, not a tool. Getting it is very easy. I include a written talk through in one of my blog posts here at the bottom of the page, but I will talk about a little bit more getting it, just very quickly in a future slide that's to come. It analyzes pages, SharePoint Online pages, both classic and modern. At first, it only looked at classic pages. So if you decided that the Diagnostics tool isn't for you or doesn't work for your circumstances, give it another look. It has evolved since the 1.0 release. This tool produces page data and statistics that suggest potential problems and situations that could potentially lead to problems, as well as many different pieces of data on page load times, request and response headers that come back to you from the web front end, the SharePoint Online web front end, as well as extensive in-product links to context-relevant resource materials, which we'll see here in a bit. Much of the data that's supplied includes color coding of some sort with stoplight colors. So red is bad or potentially problematic. Yellow means it might become a problem or is on the cusp of becoming an issue. And green means it falls within desirable service software boundaries. This data can be exported for further analysis. We'll talk about how to do that. And like I said, this is a completely free tool, so getting it is a piece of cake. The basic information that's reported after each page test, when we run it, we will get this on the Network Trace tab. We get the correlation ID. This is the response header of SP request GUID, corresponds to the correlation ID on the server. So that number is of interest to both us and Microsoft Troubleshooting, Microsoft support, because they can take that correlation ID and go back into ULS logs if logging is turned up and potentially help you troubleshoot a problem you might have. Two other numbers that are very important are the SP request duration and SPIIS latency. SP request duration is a number that represents the amount of time in milliseconds spent processing our page on the web front end with SharePoint Online. This directly corresponds to the amount of time, therefore, that it takes to render our page. The SPIIS latency, on the other hand, corresponds to the amount of time that was spent waiting on the web front end to actually start processing on our page. So this request duration and IIS latency, when you mix those with page load time, that is the amount of time that takes the web browser to send the request to SharePoint Online and get a response back, if you plug those into the equation shown and highlighted in yellow of page load time minus the summation of request duration and latency, you get what I like to call TLE. Page load time, of course, needs to be converted to milliseconds, so just multiply, well, actually the tool reports it in milliseconds. So you subtract the request duration and latency, which represents the total amount of time that our requests spent at the web front end, either in waiting or processing, and subtract from it the page load time, that value. What we get back is TLE, or time, a value, a number in milliseconds, what I refer to as time lost elsewhere. And typically, if you run this equation, once you've got those three numbers for input, this gives you a great deal of information about whether your page spent a long time waiting or due to slowness on the part of the web front end in SharePoint Online, if it took a long time in network hops or DNS lookups, something else network related, or if you've got large numbers for everything, the amount of time it spent across both the service and network conditions that slowed that down. Many time network conditions, bad network conditions can make a page look slow. This gives you a way to tease apart any sort of network conditions. It doesn't call out the specific network condition that you're seeing a problem with. It simply infers and helps you realize that the problem might not be SharePoint Online, but instead something else that I'm calling time lost elsewhere. So let's see here. Okay, Some other diagnostic test results we get back on the diagnostic tests tab are generated each time we run the test for a page. Everything from navigational checks to user checks, that is, are we running as a standard user or are we running as an admin, which does not give us an accurate reflection necessarily due to admins typically having enhanced permissions in SharePoint Online. Image checks, both for sizes and requests, whether we're using content delivery network or not, round trips, too many other requests that might be factoring in. And each of these items, anytime we have a problem, if we were to expand the drop down, for instance, in large images detected, shown in the image here on the right, that would highlight the image that was causing us a problem or the images, what the value was for those specific items, and include a direct link to data and pages on the Microsoft network, typically on Microsoft Docs, that will explain why large images are a problem and give us tips and tricks for remediating that process, those problems. So in this case, the problem of large images typically come down to use smaller images or use something that can take larger images and make them smaller for us. And SharePoint Online has some of these capabilities. For instance, the image rendition service in SharePoint Online can take a large uploaded image and convert that image into a more compressed form or use only a section of the image at runtime and thus reduce tremendously the impact of large images. So in addition to those diagnostic checks, we have other capabilities with the tool. For instance, exporting the HTTP exchange that took place between SharePoint Online and our site as an HTTP archive. An HAR file has an HAR extension, is a JSON file structure. You've got a sample shown here on the right, and it includes the entire HTTP dialog or exchange between our browser and SharePoint Online and the different requests and responses that were made from the web front end to render the entire page that we're looking at. So one page request leads to N number of additional requests and resources that are served up from SharePoint Online. All of those requests and the responses to them are captured in this exchange, which can be exported as this HAR archive and loaded into other tools for additional review and exposure, or not exposure, for investigation. So Internet Explorer and Microsoft Edge browsers, you might be familiar with F12 debugging tools. You can upload an HTTP archive, or rather ingest an HTTP archive into those tools. Fiddler or Fiddler tool, a free web debugging proxy, is another tool where you can import an HTTP archive and review the entire exchange within Fiddler and bring its tools to bear in your efforts. So you've got other options besides just the SharePoint Page Diagnostics tool. Common question that arises when you click that export to HAR, where does the file get saved if you happen to save it and not pay attention? Well, by default, that file goes in your browser's, SharePoint, your Windows operating system downloads folder. And the file name that it's given is typically a GUID that represents the correlation ID that is assigned to the particular exchange that the HAR archive represents. So look for a GUID named file in your downloads folder with a .har extension, and that will be the exchange with the web server that you're trying to get your hands on. So let's say I've just sold you on the idea of getting this SharePoint Online Page Diagnostics tool. I hope you will, especially folks who maybe looked at it in an earlier release and dismissed it as not usable for their purposes. This tool now serves other purposes in addition to diagnosing our pages. Anyone, for instance, who wants to do a site swap with SharePoint Online, that is to take, for instance, a modern site that you may have created and swap it in for your other site at the root of your SharePoint Online environment. Typically, those are classic sites. We want to start using modern sites as much as possible. That site swap tool now requires you to pass a performance analysis check using this tool. So you need the Page Diagnostics tool before you even do a site swap operation. So go out and get it. Installing it is easy. You just open Chrome, go to Chrome's extensions page in the More Tools menu shown on the right. Search for Page Diagnostics for SharePoint. You will get a hit. Install that extension, accepting the permission requests that are the tool requests, because without those permissions, it does not gain access to the rights it needs to run some of its code on your behalf. So no permission acceptance means the tool won't run. And that's all you need to do. When you successfully installed the tool and have it enabled within your Chrome extension, within your Chrome browser, at the bottom of the page, you'll see this little cyan colored rectangular button. That's the button you click to go to SharePoint Page Diagnostics tool. It'll pop open its pane. You'll have an option to start on a page analysis. Just make sure you're on your SharePoint Online page before you click that button to start on the tool itself. If you click the button to start, or to at least launch the Page Diagnostics tool as shown here, if you're not in a SharePoint Online site, you'll get a warning that the tool can't run. It'll still pop open, but there's no control surface. You'll have to go to a SharePoint Online page. So that being covered, let's talk about an acknowledgement we need to reiterate or at least understand the implications of before we start doing any sort of design and or troubleshooting. With SharePoint Online, with SPO, we are now in the cloud. That's very important, and it's very obvious if you think about it. SharePoint Online is in the cloud, but surprising number of developers and folks who build SharePoint Online pages and sites tend to forget that when they start putting pages and sites together. The key implications to that realization are you're typically in a situation where you have less bandwidth and much higher latency than you might have in an on-premises scenario. So whereas in a LAN scenario to an on-premises SharePoint farm, you might have very low sub-millisecond latency and bandwidth, that's gigabit or greater. The realization is very few people have those same sorts of performance in their online connections and their public internet connections. And so any decisions you've made that are particularly bad, like too many calls to your SharePoint site, loading images that are too large, the decision of making those tends to be amplified and leads to a lot of problems that I generally categorize in the too many, too big category. Too many images, too many JavaScript files, too large page payloads, too large images, JavaScripts, whatever. And living in the cloud, for all intents and purposes, means living lean. We have to do things in a much leaner fashion than we could get away with on premises. So what's some guidance around living lean or doing some of those things that I mentioned? Well, Microsoft is actually on your side. The picture of the guy on the right, this is a guy, his name's Scott Stewart. He's the PM at Microsoft who is responsible for portals. Particularly, he makes many of the service changes and modifications, as well as helping customers with performance issues and changes to the service that directly impact performance. And he is the #1 guy to talk to about page performance in SharePoint Online. And as it would so happen, I had a conversation with him earlier last week. And I said, look, Scott, I'm going to be giving this performance talk again to a handful of audiences. Are there suggestions you would have at this point that maybe differ from some of the things that you'd said before? So the main suggestions he had revolve around these key half-dozen bullets I show here. Keep your pages light. Typically, that's fewer than 25 references, which frankly is hard to do. A SharePoint page that references fewer than 25 images or JavaScripts, style sheets, etc., those are hard to build. So generally, if you're fewer than 100, you're doing pretty well. SharePoint Online pages, it's not unheard of to have between 100 and 200 references. And even worse than that is SharePoint Online sites. Some of the biggest ones, which have had 1,400 or 1,600 references within a single page load. Scott mentioned one particular customer who had this situation. He knew that through aggregate statistics that he gets. He does not have the capability to directly identify a customer, but he sees these numbers in aggregate. And that, as you might imagine, that 1,400 to 1,600 resource item loading site performed abysmally. It was pathetic how slow it ran. So getting those numbers down is important. Another one is the Facebook technique and the LinkedIn technique of loading only above the fold. That is, when a user first goes to a page on your site, only load resources in that initial page load that correspond to things that are shown directly on the page without any scrolling or other clicking. Don't load resources that are off the page until a user scrolls down and generates that scroll event. There are resources and tools that can help you build these lazy loading assets like JavaScripts and things like style sheets or other images. I have some of those on my website and in previous presentations I've given. So feel free to go out to my site, which I'll mention now by name, SharePointInterface.com. I will again have another link at the end. If you're building custom web parts or SharePoint framework web parts, SharePoint extensions, keep them simple. A number of things that have started impacting performance are people and developers building exceptionally large JavaScripts that represent SharePoint extensions in particular, as well as web parts. That becomes a problem as users load them, especially if they do not load them through a content delivery network. And if somebody's got to always be pulling those files down, it's going to adversely impact performance. So keep your web parts and extensions and other JavaScript files simple. Lighten them wherever you can with things like bundling or through simplifying JavaScript files. This will take all the spaces and additional references. It'll simplify those down in your JavaScript. So maybe 180K JavaScript file following minification. I'm sorry, not simplification. It is simplification, but the process is called minifying. Minify that file down. It'll get down to maybe 40K, and that's savings that directly realized by the fact you don't have 140 extra K to pull down. Employ caching wherever you can through things like local storage, cookies, things like that. But the number one recommendation Scott has is to use a CDN with your SharePoint Online site. This is very easy to do. He's actually in the process of making changes that will eventually be rolled into the service so that it happens for you somewhat transparently. You may not see these show up in the list of modifications that are made to the site because service level changes that are considered part of just the core service generally do not gain high level attention or mention in many releases regarding features because they're not new features or capabilities that arrive for end users. They're rather plumbing changes. But making that plumbing change right now is as easy as getting the SharePoint Online commandlets, load the SharePoint Online commandlets, load the dialog that the SharePoint Online portal dialog that gives you a pop-up for signing into SharePoint Online, and run SPO-set SPO tenant CDN enabled. You give that commandlet two switches, -CDN type of both if you're okay with both public and private resource storage in a CDN, Only public if your organization doesn't permit or you have some hesitancy around storing private resources in a CDN. It's worth noting that even though Microsoft's third-party CDN sources like Akamai comply with regulations and standards that might restrict the storage of resources on third-party systems, Akamai and any other third-party CDN resources Microsoft uses has undergone the certification. First-level CDN resources, private resources, are stored on CDNs that Microsoft controls, Azure resources in Microsoft. So storing merely private resources is safe every time, but check your particular organization's requirements. So use either a CDN type of both or private. And finally, stash enabled, set that to $true, which turns on the capability. You run this commandlet, reload your site, and very shortly afterwards, as things start loading, resources start loading from your SharePoint site, any SharePoint site specific platform or specific resources will start getting served through a CDN. This has immediate and recognizable performance impact. So get to using a CDN today. A large number of sites can be taking advantage. Scott said roughly 30% of SharePoint Online sites are not using CDNs optimally. So you owe it to yourself and your site's performance as well as your users to simply review your CDN status and CDN enablement within your tenant and turn it on for enabling the background resources, the plumbing resources that get loaded. CDN resources can also be turned on for SharePoint framework JavaScripts that get generated. It is, I believe, by default, but it can be turned off. Lots of developers like to turn it off during development and then forget to turn it back on. So review those for framework, web parts, and extensions. Bottom line is use CDNs, and if you're looking for prescriptive guidance on what to do on your SharePoint Online sites, go to ecs.events portal health. That resource is your number one stop anytime you're going to build a new intranet, as well as review your intranet for health and performance. It includes tons of prescriptive guidance and links to many of the Microsoft Docs resources that are referenced by the SharePoint Page Diagnostics tool, but there are tons of other resources that are linked in prescriptive guidance that is given through that ecs.events portal health. So be sure to review that. Scott, for instance, was surprised. He recently had a very large organization roll out their new portal, and this organization followed that guidance and managed to roll out their new portal in a staged way that turned it on slowly for new users, maybe 100 or 200 at a time. That gives the service the amount of time it needs to auto scale resources, SharePoint resources, to service the growing load. If you turn it on for everyone at once and suddenly 2,000 new users are hitting a site, it'll tank your SharePoint Online performance, because although SharePoint Online does scale, it doesn't do so immediately and automatically fast enough for many people. The traditional guidance still bears. Don't use anything that requires the object cache, like traditional structural navigation or content query web parts. Cached structural nav is new in the environment and beats out even managed navigation. So structural nav is no good. Cached structural nav is the best in terms of performance. That's something that's rolling out for everyone but isn't out yet, so keep an eye out for that, as well as these other suggestions here. Don't turn on publishing. That is an instant 10 to 15% overhead performance you pay in SharePoint pages where publishing is enabled. Old guidance, like I said, many of the things here: cache structural nav, use search wherever you can, understand JavaScripts and what they can do to your performance. I include lots of resources on that. Follow the recommendations of the Page Diagnostics tool. If your site is still slow after doing all these things, in particular if your TLE is high, but your request duration and IIS latency is low, start looking for network problems that may be impacting perceived performance. Things like web proxies, especially authenticating proxies, DNS lookups, non-local egress to the internet. That is, your browser has to be routed halfway around the world to leave your corporation's corporate network to get out to SharePoint. That's a lot of unnecessary routing. You want to egress locally. If all else fails, call Microsoft Support Services and they will be happy with any of these steps you've taken in terms of preemptive and prescriptive troubleshooting to try and find the problem on your own, and it gives them a jump start. So my contact information is, I'm Sean McDonough. I'm Sean at SharePointInterface.com. spmcdonough.com if you want to learn more about me, as well as any other systems and social systems, social media networks that I'm involved in. And I would like to thank you very much for your time today. I hope you got a lot out of this session. My name is Sean McDonough. SharePointInterface.com is my site. And again, thank you.
Thank you for being a part of the Galactic Collaboration Summit. Join the community and meet in-person world-class Microsoft and MVP speakers this autumn in Wiesbaden, Frankfurt, Germany, with 15 full-day tutorials and over 150 Microsoft 365 and Azure sessions at the combined European Collaboration Summit and European Cloud Summit from 26 to 28 October 2020. Community rocks.